When you think of the promise that God made to David in 1 Samuel 7, I think it is, where he says, I know what you are like, and I know what your sons will be like, but I'm making an oath right here. I swear, as long as there are stars in the heavens, there will be your son on the throne.
Yep.
This is an everlasting throne. And I know what you're going to be like. I know what your kids are going to be like. I may discipline them, but I will never take away the scepter from your house until I have established your son on his everlasting throne. And that's why all of those wicked kings were allowed to rule. Because as wicked as they were, some of them actually even made it into the genealogy in Matthew's gospel.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, it really is.
Prostitutes.
4 Gentile women in that genealogy.
Yeah. And the genealogy isn't for nothing. If you're, by the way, going through Matthew's gospel and you look at that genealogy, don't skip it and say, well, this is just the front material. I'm going to get right into the story.
To the good stuff, yeah.
That genealogy is the fast-forward version of the whole Old Testament.
It's the proof that Jesus is David's heir, and therefore why those to whom Matthew is going to preach need to listen to what he has to say.
You're listening to The White Horse Inn, and we're discussing the question, what would Moses do? How are we to read the Old Testament stories? Back in a minute. The White Horse Inn is a listener-supported broadcast. To help us get this message out, give us a call at 1-800-890-7556. That's 1-800-890-7556. You can also find information about our various support programs at our website, whitehorseinn.org. That's whitehorseinn.org.
So you might be called to pastoral ministry, but Scripture doesn't say where to go to seminary. Relax. You need help. Westminster Seminary, California. We'll give you the education you need to fulfill your calling. WSCAL.edu, 760-480-8474. Westminster Seminary, California. For Christ, His Church, and His Gospel. WSCAL.edu, 760-480-8474.
Let us love the Lord who bought us, pitied us when enemies, called us by His grace and taught us, gave us ears and gave us eyes. He has washed us with His blood. He has washed us with His blood. He has washed us with His blood. He presents our souls to God.
Welcome back to the White Horse Inn. I'm Michael Horton, and we're discussing the right way to read the Old Testament. How about Moses? I mean, what would Moses do? Would he eat a hot dog? In other words, would Moses today be kosher? Or would he be standing on this side of the dream that Peter had?
Whether he was kosher or not misses the whole point. I think you'd have to address that with a Jew and say, the whole point of Moses is that God called him to be the covenant mediator of this people, Israel, that God is going to redeem and rescue from their bondage in Egypt. And that bondage from Egypt works on 2 levels. One is the historical level of the people of God enslaved in a land where they were forbidden from going out into the desert and worshiping their own God. When they insisted on doing that, the Pharaoh persecuted them. The Pharaoh becomes an antichrist figure in redemptive history, persecuting the people of God, preventing them from worshiping Yahweh. And then on a second level, as the New Testament looks back on this, the New Testament tells us that the Exodus from Egypt kind of prefigures Christ's victory for us over sin and death.
And he went to Egypt.
Then he went to Egypt, and so as Moses was called and raised up by God to rescue national Israel from an antichrist figure, Pharaoh, to bring them through the Red Sea on dry ground, to take them through the wilderness, to bring them to the land of Canaan, give them all that was promised. All of that is historical and actually happened, but the New Testament writers look back on that and say 2 things. One is That's how we got here. God actually did this in history. So God brought historical events to this time and this place. But what you see happening there is a picture to us of what Christ is going to do. Christ is going to remove from us a greater bondage than anything Pharaoh could do, the bondage and tyranny of sin.
And Moses also, as mediator, was also the prophet of God, as Christ would also fulfill.
And pointed to this greater prophet.
Yes, absolutely.
It is interesting that Matthew's gospel, again, seems to be the whole objective of Matthew's gospel, to convince Jews that Christ is the Messiah of Israel, that there is this appeal to the story of Moses and his leadership and the Exodus and the travel through the wilderness. And in all these ways, Jesus really does recapitulate Israel's history.
Yeah.
He's called up out of Egypt, but before that, there's the Herod's slaughter of the innocents, trying to get Jesus the way Satan tried to get Moses, through Pharaoh's slaughter. And then you have being called up out of Egypt, the same way the Jews were brought forth out of Egypt through the Red Sea. And then you have Jesus' temptation in the wilderness.
40 days?
40 days.
I wonder where that number comes from.
Israel, 40 years. Anyway, you just have this succession of events where, now if you know that going to these stories, then not only in Matthew, but in the historical books, you're going to be looking for Christ.
Yeah.
You're already clued in to look for Christ.
If you're
there.
looking for helpful tips for living, the genealogy in Matthew 1 is going to be pretty boring. You know, if you're looking for victory over this, that, or the other, genealogy is not going to help you a whole lot. If you're looking for Christ in Scripture, that genealogy is huge.
Well, it's interesting that the Pharisees, or the Jews with their messianic expectations, properly from the Scriptures, in John 6, when after Jesus had fed the multitude and they wanted to make him king, they cited Moses. They said, as you must be the one, because Moses fed our fathers manna in the wilderness. And Jesus gives them a proper interpretation of that he is actually the manna. He is the bread that God feeds his people with. But they do make that correlation. They look at Moses' work in the Exodus period, and they associate it with the coming Messiah. And so they put two and two together. It's just that they have a wrong understanding of the nature of the Messiah himself.
I was having a discussion last night over dinner with Rick Ritchie, who's written for Modern Reformation, and he was mentioning a massive work that's come out. I was not aware of it, co-authored by Don Carson and someone else.
G.K. Beale.
On the New Testament's use of Old Testament text.
Outstanding.
In my day, it was R.T. France, InterVarsity publication on Jesus, or on the New Testament writers' use of the Old Testament. But Rick said this thing is going to be definitive.
Yeah, it's outstanding.
And he said, then if you bring up something like, out of Egypt have I called my son, and I said, if I did that on an exegesis paper in seminary, I'd get an F. He said, well, once you get clued into Jesus is recapitulating, he is Israel, everything looks different.
Yeah, I mean, I remember hearing exactly what a certain leading New Testament scholar or Old Testament scholar has said about this. He has said, look, evangelicals hold to the grammatical historical method of interpretation. That means that you can only interpret a passage in the light of its immediate context, and therefore you can't preach a passage from the Old Testament
nonsense
as if it's messianic. You have to interpret it within the light of its own context. So if it's about Israel, you can only talk about Israel. Now, I think that's because this particular scholar is also a dispensationalist.
Sure. I think as you're preaching through a passage like that, of course you have to present it in its original context, and the application is to go and see how the New Testament writers look back on that and tell your congregation that this is how they interpreted the passage, and this is therefore why it's about Christ. We're Christians, we're not Jews, and we shouldn't apologize for finding Christ in the Old Testament. I think methodologically you want to understand that text in its historical context first.